On a warm spring evening in March of 2006, in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Reno, Nevada, a young woman named Brianna Walsh walked out of her apartment to meet someone she trusted. She was 23 years old, a graduate student at the University of Nevada, working toward her master's degree in environmental science. She had called her mother just 2 hours earlier, her voice bright with plans for the upcoming weekend. By midnight, Brianna had vanished without a trace, leaving behind her purse, her cell phone still charging on the kitchen counter, and a half-finished cup of tea growing cold on the table. For 18 years, her family would search for answers in a case that seemed to lead nowhere, until a single photograph found in a storage unit would crack open a mystery that had haunted an entire community. The question that would echo through nearly 2 decades was simple and terrible. How does someone disappear so completely when they never intended to leave at all? Reno sits in the shadow of the Sierra Nevada mountains, a city that has always existed between worlds. Neither quite the glittering spectacle of Las Vegas, nor the peaceful solitude of Nevada's vast desert spaces. It carved out its identity as a place where people came to reinvent themselves or to escape. In 2006, the city was experiencing a housing boom. New developments sprawled outward from the historic downtown, pushing into the scrubland where jackrabbits still outnumbered residents. The Silverwood Apartments, where Brianna Walsh lived, represented this expansion. The complex had been completed only 18 months earlier, a collection of tan stucco buildings arranged around a central courtyard, with a pool that remained covered for much of the year. Young professionals lived there mostly, drawn by the reasonable rent and the proximity to both the university and the downtown core. Brianna had moved into apartment 2C in September of 2005. Her neighbors described her as friendly but private, the kind of person who would wave and exchange pleasantries, but rarely attended the occasional gatherings around the courtyard fire pit. She worked part-time at an environmental consulting firm while finishing her thesis on water conservation in arid climates. Her routine was predictable. She woke early, usually before 6, and went for a run along the Truckee River Trail before the desert heat became oppressive. She spent her mornings in class or at the library, her afternoons at the consulting firm, and her evenings back at home, where the light in her window would glow steadily, until past midnight as she worked on her research. March 17, 2006, began as an ordinary Friday. The weather forecast predicted temperatures in the mid-60s, with clear skies and the kind of dry wind that seemed to carry voices farther than they should travel. Brianna had attended her morning seminar on groundwater management at 8 o'clock. Her professor, Dr. Thomas Keller, would later tell investigators that she had been engaged and talkative, staying after class to discuss a research paper she planned to submit to a professional journal. She had seemed excited, he said, animated in a way he had not seen before. At 11:30, she had lunch with her roommate from undergraduate years, Jessica Park, at a sandwich shop near campus. Jessica would remember Brianna mentioning that she had plans that evening, but being vague about the details. When Jessica pressed, Brianna had smiled and said something about finally getting closure on something that had been bothering her for weeks. Clear's throat. Brianna arrived at the consulting firm at 1 o'clock and worked until 5:30. Her supervisor, Margaret Chen, noted that Brianna had completed her assigned tasks efficiently and had asked to leave 30 minutes early, which was unusual. Margaret had agreed without question. Brianna had driven her Honda Civic back to Silverwood Apartments, arriving at approximately 6 o'clock. Her downstairs neighbor, an elderly man named Robert Finch, was watering the small patch of grass near his ground floor unit when she pulled into her assigned parking space. He would later tell investigators that she had waved to him as she climbed the exterior stairs to her second-floor apartment, her canvas work bag slung over one shoulder. He remembered thinking she looked tired but content. Inside apartment 2C, Brianna changed out of her work clothes and into jeans and a gray university sweatshirt. She made herself a cup of chamomile tea and called her mother in Sacramento. The call lasted 12 minutes. Her mother, Patricia Walsh, would replay the conversation in her mind thousands of times in the years that followed. They had talked about nothing consequential. Brianna had mentioned her thesis defense, scheduled for early May. She had asked about her younger brother, who was finishing his sophomore year at UC Davis. She had laughed at something her mother said about the family cat. Patricia would tell investigators that her daughter had sounded normal, perhaps slightly distracted, but nothing that raised any concern. The call ended at 7:42 in the evening. At approximately 8:15, Brianna locked her apartment door and walked down the exterior stairs. Robert Finch was no longer outside, but another resident, a graduate student named Derek Munoz who lived in the adjacent building, was returning from a convenience store run. He saw Brianna walking across the parking lot toward the street. She was alone. She did not get into her car. Derek assumed she was going for a walk, something he had seen her do occasionally in the evenings when the weather was pleasant. He thought nothing of it at the time. He carried his grocery bag up to his apartment, put away his purchases, and never saw Brianna Walsh again. When Brianna did not return Jessica's text messages the following morning, Jessica felt a prickle of concern but nothing more. When Brianna missed their scheduled coffee meeting on Saturday afternoon, Jessica drove to Silverwood Apartments and knocked on the door of Unit 2C. There was no answer. Jessica called Brianna's cell phone and heard it ringing faintly from inside the apartment. She peered through the front window and saw the phone on the kitchen counter, its screen illuminating with her incoming call. The unease that had been building in Jessica's chest suddenly crystallized into genuine fear. She called the apartment manager, who initially refused to open the door, citing privacy policies. Jessica called Patricia Walsh, who called the Reno Police Department. By 6 o'clock on Saturday evening, March 18th, an officer arrived at Silverwood Apartments. The manager unlocked the door. Inside, everything appeared undisturbed. Brianna's purse sat on the small dining table. Her wallet contained her driver's license and credit cards. Her laptop was open on the couch, displaying a screensaver. The tea she had made the previous evening sat on the kitchen counter, a thin film on its surface. Her car keys hung on a hook by the door. Her car remained in its parking space. The apartment showed no signs of struggle, no evidence of forced entry, no indication that anything was wrong except for the unmistakable fact that Brianna Walsh was simply gone. Part 2. The investigation. The search began in earnest on Sunday morning, March 19th. The Washoe County Sheriff's Office coordinated with Reno Police Department to establish a command center in the Silverwood Apartments community room. Sergeant Michael Torres, a veteran investigator with the sheriff's office, took lead on the case. He had worked missing persons cases before, and he understood the grim statistics. The first 48 hours were critical. After that, the likelihood of finding someone alive dropped precipitously. Deputies canvassed the apartment complex, knocking on every door, asking the same questions. Had anyone seen Brianna Walsh after 8 o'clock on Friday evening? Had anyone heard anything unusual? Arguments, loud noises, vehicles coming or going at odd hours. Most residents had seen nothing. A few remembered Brianna in passing but could offer no useful information. Derek Munoz came forward immediately and told investigators about seeing Brianna walking toward the street. His statement established the last confirmed sighting at approximately 8:15 in the evening on March 17th. Search and rescue teams assembled at dawn on Monday morning. Volunteers from the community joined deputies and trained search personnel. They spread out in a grid pattern, starting from Silverwood Apartments and moving outward. They walked the streets of the surrounding neighborhoods, peered into storm drains, checked dumpsters, searched vacant lots where desert scrub grew thick between half-built subdivisions. Helicopters from the sheriff's office flew overhead. their searchlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness, scanning the undeveloped land that stretched for miles in every direction. The Truckee River, where Brianna ran most mornings, received particular attention. Dive teams searched the sections closest to her apartment, looking for any sign that she might have fallen or been pushed into the cold, fast-moving water. By Tuesday, the story had reached the local news stations. Brianna's photograph appeared on the evening broadcasts. Her mother and father, Patricia and David Walsh, drove from Sacramento and held a tearful press conference outside the Washoe County Sheriff's Office, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. The tip line rang constantly, but most calls led nowhere. Someone thought they had seen a young woman matching Brianna's description at a gas station in Sparks. Another caller reported seeing her at a casino in downtown Reno. Investigators followed every lead methodically, and each one dissolved into nothing. Clear's throat, what troubled Sergeant Torres from the beginning was the lack of evidence. In most missing persons cases, particularly those involving foul play, there were signs. A struggle, even a brief one, left traces. People did not simply evaporate. He stood in Brianna's apartment on Tuesday afternoon, after the forensic team had finished processing the scene, and tried to understand what he was seeing. The apartment told the story of someone who had intended to return. The tea on the counter, the phone charging, the laptop still open. These were not the actions of someone planning to disappear voluntarily. But if Brianna had been taken, where was the evidence of an abduction? The door showed no signs of forced entry. There were no defensive wounds noted in the apartment, no overturned furniture, no disturbed belongings. Investigators pulled Brianna's phone records. Her last outgoing call had been to her mother at 7:30 that evening. After that, nothing. No calls, no texts, no data usage. Her credit cards had not been used since Thursday afternoon, when she had purchased lunch near campus. Her bank account showed no withdrawals. Surveillance footage from businesses along the main road near Silverwood Apartments revealed nothing useful. No cameras had captured Brianna walking past after 8:15. Those who knew Brianna said she was not the type to vanish deliberately. She had close relationships with her family. She was on track to complete her degree. She had no known debts, no legal troubles, no apparent reason to run. Her friends described her as responsible and level-headed. Jessica Park told investigators that Brianna had been in good spirits in recent weeks, perhaps a bit preoccupied, but nothing that suggested distress or fear. By the end of the first week, leads had slowed to a trickle. Sergeant Torres expanded the investigation, looking into Brianna's background more thoroughly. She had dated someone during her undergraduate years, a relationship that had ended 2 years prior. The former partner, now living in Oregon, had a solid confirmation of his location for the weekend in question. Brianna's colleagues at the consulting firm were interviewed extensively. All spoke highly of her. None could think of anyone who might wish her harm. On March 25th, 9 days after Brianna's disappearance, a hiker found a gray sweatshirt along a trail in the foothills west of Reno. It matched the description of what Brianna had been wearing. The garment was sent to the crime lab for analysis. Forensic examination revealed that the sweatshirt was indeed Brianna's size and bore a university logo identical to the one she owned. But there were no bloodstains, no tears, no signs of struggle. DNA analysis confirmed it had been worn by Brianna, but that told investigators nothing they did not already know. The discovery of the sweatshirt felt significant, but it led nowhere conclusive. The trail where it was found was popular with hikers and runners. Brianna could have lost it there on a previous run, or someone could have placed it there deliberately. The question of whether the sweatshirt was evidence or distraction hung unanswered. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves about the strangeness of the case. Sergeant Torres found himself returning to the basic questions. Who had Brianna gone to meet that evening? Jessica had mentioned Brianna being vague about her plans. What had she meant about getting closure on something that had been bothering her? Investigators interviewed Brianna's professors, her classmates, anyone who might know what had been troubling her in recent weeks. Dr. Keller mentioned that Brianna had seemed concerned about something related to her research, but he could not provide specifics. She had mentioned discovering discrepancies in data she was analyzing, something that did not add up, but she had not elaborated. By April, the active search had wound down. Volunteers returned to their regular lives. The media moved on to other stories. The tip line calls became less frequent. Brianna Walsh's case remained open, but without new evidence, there was little investigators could do except wait and hope that someone with information would eventually come forward. Sergeant Torres kept the file on his desk, reviewing it regularly, but the leads had dried up completely. The case, like so many others, went cold. Part 3. The silence 16 months passed. The calendar turned to July of 2007, and the summer heat bore down on Reno with relentless intensity. Patricia and David Walsh had not stopped searching. They distributed flyers at every opportunity. They maintained a website dedicated to finding their daughter. They appeared on local news programs whenever a station would have them. But as the months stretched on, the terrible possibility that they might never know what happened to Brianna settled over them like a weight they could not put down. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt the slow erosion of trust that comes from unanswered questions, the Walsh family's ordeal may resonate deeply. There was no body, no confirmed evidence that Brianna had come to harm, but there was also no evidence she was alive. They existed in a terrible limbo, unable to grieve fully, unable to move forward. David Walsh became obsessed with the case, spending hours each evening reading and rereading the police reports that Sergeant Torres periodically shared with the family. Patricia found herself frozen between hope and despair, crying at unexpected moments, unable to focus on anything except the daughter who was missing. In August of 2007, a local investigative journalist named Karen Mitchell published a long-form article in a Reno newspaper about unsolved missing persons cases in northern Nevada. She dedicated several pages to Brianna Walsh, interviewing friends and family, retracing the known timeline of that March evening. The article raised questions about whether investigators had pursued all possible leads. Had anyone looked closely at Brianna's work at the consulting firm? She had been analyzing environmental data for various clients. Had she discovered something someone wanted kept quiet? The article generated renewed public interest, but it did not produce new evidence. Clear's throat. What no one outside the investigation knew was that Sergeant Torres had developed a theory. It was based more on instinct than evidence, and he had shared it only with his supervisor. He believed Brianna had gone to meet someone she knew that evening, someone she trusted. The lack of struggle, the fact that she had left her apartment willingly without her phone or purse, suggested she had not anticipated being gone long. She had expected to return quickly, but something had gone wrong. Whoever she had met had either caused her harm deliberately or had been involved in an accident they chose to conceal. Without knowing who that person was, the theory remained just that, a hypothesis without substance. In November of 2008, 2.5 years after Brianna's disappearance, Patricia and David Walsh made the agonizing decision to hold a memorial service. There was no body to bury, no grave to visit, but they needed something to mark their loss, some way to acknowledge that their daughter was gone. The service was held at a church in Sacramento. More than 200 people attended. Friends from Brianna's high school and college years came. Her professors and colleagues from the consulting firm came. Sergeant Torres came, standing in the back, watching the faces in the crowd, looking for anything that might seem out of place. He saw only genuine grief. By 2010, the case file for Brianna Walsh had been moved to the cold case section. Sergeant Torres had retired. New investigators took over the remaining active cases. Brianna's name was entered into national databases for missing persons, and her information was shared with agencies across the country, but no new leads emerged. Her family tried to rebuild some semblance of normal life. David Walsh developed health problems that his doctors attributed to stress. Patricia Walsh started volunteering with organizations that supported families of missing persons, channeling her pain into helping others who faced similar ordeals. The years accumulated like layers of dust on an untouched surface. 2011 became 2012, then 2013. The city of Reno continued to grow. The Silverwood apartments changed ownership. New tenants moved into Unit 2C, unaware of the mystery that had unfolded there. The case remained officially open, but no one was actively working it. In law enforcement, this was known as a cold case limbo, neither formally closed nor receiving investigative attention. For those who have noticed how time can soften even the sharpest pain, the Walsh family experienced this strange mercy. They never stopped thinking about Brianna, never stopped hoping for answers, but the acute agony of the first years gradually transformed into a chronic ache they learned to carry. They celebrated holidays and birthdays marked by absence. They watched Brianna's younger brother graduate from college, get engaged, start a career. Life moved forward, but there was always the awareness of what was missing, who was missing. In 2015, Patricia Walsh was diagnosed with breast cancer. She underwent treatment and recovered, but the experience changed her perspective. She told friends that she had made peace with the possibility that she might never know what happened to her daughter. It was a necessary surrender, a way to keep living. David Walsh never quite reached that acceptance. He kept a box of materials related to Brianna's case in his home office, newspaper clippings and police reports and photographs. He took it out periodically, reviewing everything again, looking for something he might have missed. What neither of them could have known was that the key to solving their daughter's case was sitting in a storage unit less than 50 miles away, in a cardboard box beneath old clothing and forgotten household items, waiting to be discovered. Part 4. The revelation. The break came on a Saturday morning in February of 2024, 18 years after Brianna Walsh disappeared. A man named Gregory Hoffman was clearing out a storage unit in Sparks, Nevada, that had belonged to his uncle, Terrence Hoffman, who had passed away 3 months earlier from complications related to diabetes. Gregory had procrastinated on the task, dreading the tedious work of sorting through decades of accumulated possessions. The storage unit was a 10 by 15 space crammed with furniture, boxes of documents, old electronics, and the general detritus of a life lived. Gregory worked methodically, creating piles for donation, disposal, and the few items worth keeping. Near the back of the unit, beneath a stack of mildewed blankets, he found a cardboard box sealed with packing tape that had yellowed with age. He cut the tape and opened the box. Inside were personal items, a watch, some coins, a stack of old photographs bound with a rubber band. Gregory flipped through the photographs absently. Most showed his uncle at various stages of life, some alone, some with friends Gregory did not recognize. Then he came to a photograph that made him pause. The image showed a young woman sitting in what appeared to be the passenger seat of a car. She looked uncomfortable, her expression tense, her body angled slightly away from the camera. The photograph was dated, printed on the back in faded ink, March 17, 2006. Gregory stared at the date, then at the woman's face. Something about the image disturbed him in a way he could not immediately articulate. He set the photograph aside and continued sorting through the box. Beneath the photographs, he found a small spiral notebook. The pages contained handwritten entries, dated sporadically over several years. Gregory read a few entries. They were disjointed, rambling, sometimes incoherent. His uncle had struggled with mental health issues throughout his life, something the family rarely discussed openly. But one entry, dated March 18, 2006, stood out. It read, "She would not stop asking questions. I did not mean for it to happen this way. I thought she would understand. Now I do not know what to do. I cannot think clearly. Clear's throat, Gregory felt his stomach tighten. He looked again at the photograph dated March 17th. He picked up his phone and searched for missing persons cases from 2006 in the Reno area. It took less than 5 minutes to find Brianna Walsh's case. The photograph on the missing persons poster matched the face in the picture he held. The dates aligned exactly. The implications crashed over him in a nauseating wave. His uncle, whom he had known as eccentric but harmless, whom the family had always described as troubled but gentle, might have been responsible for a young woman's disappearance nearly 2 decades earlier. Gregory called the Washoe County Sheriff's Office immediately. He was transferred to the Detective Division and connected with Detective Rachel Ortiz, who now handled cold cases. Gregory explained what he had found, his voice shaking as he described the photograph and the notebook entry. Detective Ortiz listened carefully, asked him to repeat certain details, then told him not to touch anything else in the box. She would send someone to collect the evidence immediately. Within 2 hours, Detective Ortiz and a forensic team arrived at the storage unit in Sparks. They documented the scene, photographed the box and its contents in situ, then carefully collected everything as evidence. The photograph of Brianna Walsh was sent to the crime lab for analysis. The notebook was examined for fingerprints and subjected to handwriting verification. Meanwhile, Detective Ortiz pulled the case file for Brianna Walsh and began reading through 18 years of reports, witness statements, and investigative notes. Terrence Hoffman's name appeared in the file. He had worked as a data analyst at the same environmental consulting firm where Brianna had been employed part-time. In March of 2006, he had been 41 years old, unmarried, living alone in a rental house in northwest Reno. He had been interviewed twice in the weeks following Brianna's disappearance. The first interview had been routine, part of the broad canvas of everyone who worked at the consulting firm. Terrence had told investigators he barely knew Brianna, that they had worked on different projects and rarely interacted. He had stated that he was home alone on the evening of March 17th, watching television. No one could confirm this statement, but there had been no evidence to suggest he was lying. The second interview had occurred after Brianna's sweatshirt was found in the foothills. Investigators had re-interviewed several people from the consulting firm, pressing harder, asking more pointed questions. Terrence had seemed nervous during this interview, according to the notes, but investigators had attributed this to general anxiety rather than guilt. He had a documented history of social anxiety disorder. His nervousness had not seemed unusual given his personality. The interview had ended without raising suspicions. Terrence Hoffman had never been considered a serious person of interest. He had continued working at the consulting firm until 2009, when he had left for unspecified reasons. After that, he had held a series of short-term jobs, struggled with health issues, and eventually gone on permanent disability. Detective Ortiz obtained a search warrant for Terrence Hoffman's last known residence, an apartment in Sparks where he had lived until his passing in November 2023. The landlord had not yet cleared out the unit. Forensic teams descended on the apartment, searching for any additional evidence that might connect Terrence to Brianna's disappearance. They found nothing immediately incriminating, but they collected his personal computer, external hard drives, and boxes of papers for further examination. The photograph was analyzed by experts. The metadata confirmed it had been taken with a digital camera on March 17, 2006. The location data embedded in the file indicated it had been photographed somewhere in the area west of Reno, in the foothills where Brianna's sweatshirt had been found. The image showed Brianna in clear distress. Her hands were visible at the bottom of the frame, and forensic analysts noted what appeared to be dirt or abrasions on her wrists, though the image quality made definitive conclusions difficult. The interior of the vehicle visible in the photograph matched the description of a car Terrence Hoffman had owned in 2006, a silver Honda Accord that he had sold in 2007. The notebook entries were subjected to linguistic analysis. Mental health experts reviewed them and concluded that they were consistent with someone experiencing severe psychological distress, possibly guilt or remorse. The entry from March 18th did not constitute a clear confession, but combined with the photograph and the other evidence, it built a compelling narrative. Terrence Hoffman had known Brianna Walsh. She had discovered something through her work, something that involved him. She had confronted him. The meeting that evening had not been coincidental or innocent. What happened after Brianna got into his car remained unknown, but the evidence suggested it had ended in her demise. Detective Ortiz tracked down the Honda Accord that Terrence had sold in 2007. The current owner was a resident of Carson City who had purchased the vehicle third-hand in 2015. The car had changed hands multiple times, but forensic teams examined it anyway, looking for any trace evidence that might remain. They found nothing conclusive after so many years and subsequent owners. Without a body and without a living suspect to interrogate, the case presented significant challenges for prosecutors. The evidence was strong but circumstantial. The photograph placed Brianna with Terrence on the evening she disappeared. The notebook suggested knowledge of a tragic event, but neither constituted absolute proof of what had happened to Brianna Walsh or where her remains might be located. In April of 2024, Detective Ortiz made the decision to search the area where the photograph had been taken. Using the metadata from the image file and geographical analysis, forensic experts narrowed down the possible location to a roughly 2-square-mile area in the foothills west of Reno. Search teams, including cadaver detection units and ground-penetrating radar specialists, spent 3 weeks systematically covering the terrain. On May 2, 2024, a cadaver dog alerted near a dense grove of juniper trees approximately 6 miles from the nearest paved road. The area was remote, accessible only by rough dirt tracks that would challenge most vehicles. Excavation began immediately. At a depth of approximately 4 feet, investigators uncovered human remains that had been buried in a shallow grave. The remains were carefully extracted and transported to the medical examiner's office. Forensic anthropology and dental records confirmed what everyone already knew. The remains were those of Brianna Walsh. She had been there, alone in the desert, for 18 years. The medical examiner determined that she had sustained blunt force trauma to the head, injuries consistent with being struck with a heavy object. The cause of termination was listed as cranial injury due to assault. The manner was confirmed as deliberate. Detective Ortiz called Patricia and David Walsh on the afternoon of May 3, 2024. She told them that their daughter had been found. She told them that they now knew what had happened. She told them that the person responsible was no longer alive to face justice in court, but that the case was solved. Patricia Walsh cried. David Walsh asked if Brianna had suffered. Detective Ortiz answered as truthfully and as gently as she could. Some things were better left unsaid. Some details served no purpose except to deepen pain. The story reached the media within days. News outlets across Nevada covered the resolution of the 18-year-old mystery. Headlines read, "Cold Case Solved. Brianna Walsh found after nearly 2 decades, and storage unit discovery leads to closure in 2006 disappearance." The Reno Gazette-Journal published a comprehensive retrospective on the case, interviewing family members, former investigators, and experts on cold case investigations. The community that had searched for Brianna in 2006, many of whom still remembered her face on the missing person posters, responded with a mixture of relief and sadness. Gregory Hoffman gave interviews to local media, explaining how he had discovered the evidence in his uncle's storage unit. He expressed sorrow for the Walsh family and stated that he wished he had known sooner so he could have brought them closure years earlier. He described his uncle as a troubled man who had been kind in some ways, but clearly carried dark secrets. The revelation had shattered Gregory's understanding of his own family, and he was undergoing therapy to process the trauma of discovering his uncle's involvement in such a terrible event. Those who had known Terrence Hoffman at the consulting firm expressed shock. Margaret Chen, who had been Brianna's supervisor and had also worked with Terrence, told reporters she could not reconcile the quiet, awkward man she remembered with someone capable of such action. Others who had worked alongside him recalled him as socially isolated and sometimes inappropriate in his interactions with female colleagues, but nothing that had seemed dangerous at the time. In retrospect, some admitted there had been moments when his behavior had made them uncomfortable, but they had dismissed their instincts as uncharitable. Dr. Keller, Brianna's thesis advisor, remembered the conversation she had with him after class on the day she disappeared. She had mentioned discrepancies in data. Detective Ortiz reviewed Brianna's research files and discovered that she had been analyzing water usage data for several clients of the consulting firm. One set of data, submitted by a client for whom Terrence Hoffman had been the primary analyst, contained inconsistencies that suggested manipulation or falsification. Brianna had flagged these issues and had planned to report them. It appeared she had confronted Terrence about the discrepancies before filing an official complaint. That confrontation had likely been the catalyst for what followed. The motive, as far as investigators could reconstruct it, involved professional misconduct. Terrence had been falsifying data to make it appear that a client was complying with environmental regulations when they were not. Brianna had discovered this, and Terrence had panicked. Whether he had planned to harm her or whether the situation had escalated unintentionally remained unclear. The notebook entries suggested he had not intended for things to end as they did, but intention mattered little in the face of the outcome. On June 15, 2024, the Washoe County Sheriff's Office held a press conference officially closing the Brianna Walsh case. Detective Ortiz stood at the podium alongside the sheriff and outlined the evidence that had led to solving the mystery. She announced that while Terrence Hoffman could not be prosecuted due to his passing, the investigation had conclusively determined he was responsible for Brianna's abduction and subsequent demise. She thanked Gregory Hoffman for coming forward and credited his actions with finally bringing closure to a case that had haunted investigators for 18 years. Patricia and David Walsh sat in the front row during the press conference. They had declined to speak publicly, but they released a written statement that was read aloud. It thanked law enforcement for never giving up on their daughter's case. It expressed gratitude to the community that had searched for Brianna and kept her memory alive. It acknowledged the complex emotions they felt, relief at finally knowing the truth mixed with renewed grief at having their worst fears confirmed. The statement ended with a request for privacy, as they made arrangements to lay their daughter to rest. Brianna Walsh was finally given a proper burial in August of 2024 at a cemetery in Sacramento near where she had grown up. The service was private, attended only by close family and a few friends. Detective Ortiz attended, as did Sergeant Torres, who came out of retirement to pay his respects. The case he had worked so hard to solve all those years ago had finally found resolution, though not in the way anyone would have hoped. Closing the resolution of Brianna Walsh's case serves as a reminder that time does not erase truth, and that answers can emerge from unexpected places even after years of silence. For every case that finds resolution, there are countless others that remain open, their mysteries unsolved, their families waiting. Brianna's story ended with knowledge, if not justice in the traditional sense. Her family knows what happened. She has a grave they can visit. The questions that tormented them for 18 years have been answered. In the end, what remains is the memory of a young woman who worked towards something meaningful, who cared about truth and integrity, and who paid a terrible price for trying to do what was right. Brianna Walsh was 23 years old when she disappeared, a person with plans and dreams and people who loved her. She deserved better than the fate that found her on that March evening in 2006. She deserved to finish her degree, to build a career, to live the life that was stolen from her. What happened to Brianna matters because she mattered, because every person whose story ends in tragedy deserves to be remembered and honored. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.